We're in the third part of a four-part series entitled The God I Wish You Knew, and it's interesting how our view and our concept of God shapes everything in our life, especially for those of us who are believers and even for those who may not be. And we've talked about how God is our Father, how He speaks to us so far, and today we're going to talk about God is big. And I know when you see this title, The God I Wish You Knew, God is big, the first thing that comes to your mind is, duh, Joey. Okay, everybody knows God is big. And the truth is that we may intellectually understand this, but sometimes we struggle understanding that God is bigger than us. You know, the Apostle Paul had a thorn in his flesh that reminded him that God was in charge and that He was over all and in all. And every one of us, when we feel high and mighty, like maybe we don't need God anymore, we have that thorn in the flesh that continues to remind us. Even preachers. You know, it's interesting. I speak to you every Sunday morning, and if you've ever been a preacher or you know a preacher, the thing you need to know about preachers is they come and talk to you on Sunday mornings because they really think they got something to say. Now, whether they do or not is up to you, but they think they have something to say, and it's real easy to become proud. And so my thorn in the flesh happened to me about 20 years ago. I wrote a book. It was entitled Water to Wine, not From Water to Wine, which is grammatically correct, Water to Wine. And so in order to be humble, I check on how my book is doing, which, by the way, in the history of 21st century Christian, it's probably the biggest failure in their history. And so what I did this week in order to be humbled and to remember that God is big and I'm not, is I went to Google and I Googled myself. And this is what came up with. If you can't see that from the back, it's Water to Wine, Joseph Davis. And the very top entry is eBay. You can find this book on eBay, and which, by the way, eBay is the capital of buyer's remorse. That's people trying to get rid of things they don't want. But the second one is the one that really makes me feel good. It's this site called Forgotten Books. Oh, it gets better. At eCrater, which evidently there's this big electronic crater they throw these books in, .com. So when I start thinking that I'm a big deal, I go and I realize that my hard work from 20 years ago is now in some eCrater of forgotten books.com. God's big. And you know, we're, this year our theme has been to be recaptured by wonder. The idea of the enormity of God is something that should always be in the back of our mind. Last week I started the sermon with this quote from A.W. Tozier. It says, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. What we think of when we think of God is the most important thing about who we are. And so we need to understand that our God is big, and when we recognize the enormity of who God is, we stand back in awe and in wonder. Well, if you're looking at your teaching notes this morning, our first teaching note is this. The amount of trust you have in God depends on how you view Him. When you think about God, when you're in your mind thinking about God and you're creating this image of God, the amount of trust you have in God is directly correlated to that image. That's how you see Him. It's how you view Him. Some people view God this way. You notice the real security guard's the back. He's an old dude and he's asleep, but the picture in front of him is this bad dude with this great big shotgun. And they see God as this God that is really in charge. He's gung-ho, but in their real mind's eye, they think of Him as this old father who dropped the Bible out of the airplane one day and said, good luck. Is that you? Is that your God? When you tell everybody in the world that your God really is this one in the front, that He's this big God, that in your mind's eye you really believe that He's not really all that big. You thought God was a tough guy, but I want you to remember this as we go through this lesson. If we have a small God that produces small faith, we will live a small life. A small God produces small faith that leads to a small life. The opposite is also true. A big God leads to big faith, which equals a big life. So I want to talk about those things this morning. What is a big God for a big life? I firmly believe that many of us live these lives of quiet desperation because we do not believe that our God is big enough. Somehow, some way, we think that, yeah, God created all this, but he's really kind of an absentee God, and he's not working in our lives. J.B. Phillips put it this way. He said, the trouble with many people today is they have not found a God that's big enough for modern needs. When many people think of God, they think of this God from a long time ago who used to do things, but now he doesn't do things anymore. But the reality is that we have a big and a mighty and a strong God. You know, having a big God really affects everything in our life. It really does. When we think of God and we have this image of God, the bigger our God is, the more it affects everything that goes on in our life. Several years ago, my wife and I were visiting with friends in Nashville, and they took us to this restaurant. Now, these friends evidently are able to afford really good meals. You know, it wasn't McDonald's. It was a nice place. And so I get up and I go into the restroom, and it's not normal men's room. It was just like really nice. And we're in there waiting in line, and in walks this mountain of a human being. And it was a guy named Kevin Carter. You may know who Kevin Carter is. He played defensive end for the Titans, and he played for the Rams when they beat the Titans in the Super Bowl, and the guy was huge. And he walks in, and y'all know the man rules for restrooms, right? You don't look at another guy. You don't speak to another guy. You don't. But this guy walks in, and he couldn't be ignored, and one guy looks at him and says, "Man, you're big." And how do you respond to that? He said, "Thank you." That's how it went. That was the whole conversation. But I started thinking, as big as he is, God's bigger. You know, I love the sport of football, and it's kind of interesting. There was a book that came out several years ago, and a movie that came out called The Blind Side. It was written by a woman named Leanne Toohey, who adopted this young man, Michael Orr, and you've probably seen the movie. But in the movie, she talks about the sport and how that the quarterback of the football team, paying him is like paying the house note. But when you pay that left tackle, the guy that's got his blind side, that's paying the insurance. This morning, I want to talk about if we have a big God that's big like Kevin Carter, that's big like Taylor Lewan with the Titans, or big like a lot of these players that are in NFL, and they've got our blind side, who has your blind side? And when we think about God having our blind side, that's a humbling thought, because it leads us to understand that we are vulnerable. And the reality is, the more vulnerable we are in this world, the more protection we need. And if this is true, the more vulnerable we are, the more protection we need, then it is also true that as people who are in the world but not of the world, we've got to have somebody that's got our blind side. And that having a big God is incredibly, incredibly important. So I want to talk about first the big God who has your blind side. In Isaiah 45, verses 2 through 5, we read this. It says, "I will go before you and make the rough places smooth. I will shatter the doors of bronze and cut through their iron bars, so that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who calls you by name." God is telling these people, he's saying, I am a big God. I tear down mountains for my people. I break through doors of bronze for my people. I cut through iron bars for my people. I've got your blind side. And in the 27th Psalm, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the defense of my life. Whom shall I dread? When evildoers come upon me to devour my flesh, my adversaries and my enemies, they stumbled and fell. Though a host encamp against me, my heart will not fear. Though war arise against me, in spite of this, I shall be confident. We need to understand that in order to live a big life, Jesus called it an abundant life. John 10:10, he says, I came that you may have life and have it more abundantly. If we're going to be people who live an abundant life, our image of God must be that he is a big God. And not only is he a big God, he is a big God who's got our blind side. He's watching out for us. And the more vulnerable we are, the more powerful he becomes. I was trying to think of a quote that I could put with this being a big God, and I thought about a song I hear around my house a lot, and it's this: you don't want to mess with us, got Jesus on my necklace. Kesha. I know, he drew out Kesha in the middle of a sermon. I am the only preacher who'll be using a Kesha quote today. But man, God is on our side, and you don't want to mess with us because we're God's people. We have a big God, and because we have a big God, we have a big life. Well, if we have a big God that leads to a big life, well, what does big faith look like? You know, we have this God that shatters mountains before us. We have a God who knows every hair on our head, some more than others, and we have a big God that's got our blind side. But isn't it interesting that though we intellectually know that, sometimes we're able to disconnect it from our faith? We're able to disconnect it from the way we actually live our lives, that we're not willing to take risk, that we're not willing to step out in this world. We're not really willing to let our guard down and share our Lord with our neighbors when we have a big God who's got our blind side. But so often that's the case. There are a couple of stories in Scripture that kind of contrast this idea. The first story, as I set it up, is a story of the disciples have a man come to them, and he's got a son. The son is going into seizures, fits, however your translation calls it. More than likely he was epileptic. And he had brought him to different people to be healed, and they couldn't cast these demons out. They called it demon-possessed. And so they brought him to the disciples, and they asked him to cast. They tried and they couldn't cast the demons out. And so they finally, I could just see them like little boys going to Jesus and kind of kicking the dirt, going, Jesus, we tried, but we couldn't do this. And so Jesus, as we find the story goes in Matthew 17, says, then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, why could we not drive it out? Because Jesus had cast these demons out. And he said to them, it's because of the littleness of your faith. For truly I say to you, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, I have a mustard seed right here. Can everybody see it? No, you can't, because I don't really have one. If I did, you couldn't see it. But if I had a mustard seed, they're tiny. If you have the faith of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. And nothing will be impossible to you. It's amazing what faith can do in the lives of people. It's amazing the power that faith has. Yet these people, although they'd been around Jesus this whole time, he's telling them still, you know what? You've been around me. You've seen me do these things. They had seen him raise people from the dead. They had seen him heal people. They'd seen all these things go on. They'd seen him walk on water. They'd seen all this happen. Yet still their faith was not quite where it should be. Contrast to the story, there was a soldier who had a servant who was sick. He didn't come himself. He sent some of his men to see Jesus and to ask him to heal his servant. And the story goes like this. In Luke chapter 7, verses 6 through 10, it says, now Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason, I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I'm also a man placed under authority, soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes. To another, come, and he comes. To my slave, do this, and he does it. And now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him and turned and said to the crowd that was following, look at what he says. I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Here's this story. Here's a man who didn't even come to him because he had such great faith that he knew Jesus just had to say the word. He understood what authority was. He was a person who had some authority, but he also let Jesus know, even though I have authority, it's nothing like yours. Even though I have power, it's nothing like your power, because I can't help my slave, but you can. And Jesus turns to those disciples that are around him, and he's saying, you know about a big God. You're of Israel. Not even in Israel have I found faith like this. And Israel knows about what a big God he is. The problem is, you've been too close. This next teaching point, I think, is kind of interesting. And sometimes we miss the enormity of God because we never stopped to notice him from a distance. Sometimes you can be too close. Sometimes you can be so close and so accustomed to something that it loses its amazing nature. You can be too close to a person and you'll start to see their flaws, or you'll be so close to a person that you'll begin to take them for granted. Or you'll have a blessing in your life and eventually you'll pick the blessing apart because it just doesn't seem quite as grand once you have it. And it's the same way with our relationship with Jesus sometimes. Oh, we see him as this big God. We see our God as this big God, but we've been so close to him for so long that it has become so commonplace that it's affected our faith. And so we back away from God. And by the way, that statement, and I'll read it again, it just says, sometimes we miss the enormity of God because we never stop to notice him from a distance. All of us have been distant. We have all been distant from God. At some point in our life and in some part of our journey, we've been far off from God. And when we saw him and we saw the enormity of God, that's what drew us to him. But it's very easy to be like the disciples and be so close that you can't see. Because sometimes it's good to be like the centurion, that when you're far off, you can see an amazing God. And when you see this amazing God, it brings out in your life an amazing, amazing faith. One of the symptoms of a small God that leads to small faith that gives you small life is when you believe that you have a problem that God can't solve. Not that God won't solve, but you believe you have a problem that God can't deal with. If you don't believe he can, he probably won't. God responds to people with faith. I wrote this down because I stole it from somebody. I'm not smart enough to come up with new stuff, but it's a thing called memo from God. I want to read it to you. It says, memo from God to you from the Creator. Let me get my eyes on. Subject to this memo is you. It says, I am God. Today I'll be handling all of your problems. Please remember that I do not need your help. If life happens to deliver a situation you cannot handle, do not attempt to resolve it. Kindly put it in the SFGTD, which stands for Stuff for God to Do, box. Signed, the Creator. That's what he says. We have a God that's got our blind side, and if he were to send us a memo, he'd say, listen, I know there's going to be things in your life. Let me do them. It'll increase your faith, but you got to have big faith in a big God in order to live a big life. In order to understand the enormity and the strength and the power of God, I got a brief word study I'm going to lead you through here, and it's about the arm of God. Now, the interesting part is, when we think of, God mentions his arm in Scripture, he's talking about his power, his might, his strength. And I don't know how many of you go to the gym. The gym I go to is just right down the road. There's this one guy in our gym, and he's huge. Do I think he took steroids? Yeah. But his arms are like both of mine put together, except there's no fat on his arms. There's no wobble under here. I mean, he's muscular. And I look at this guy, and back when I was at my heaviest, I used to love to go to the gym and stand beside him because it was the only time I felt small. This guy's huge, and we watch him lift weights, and it was like he was just barely groaning with all this weight on him. The guy was enormous. And I just stood in awe. And then we start thinking about the arm of God and what that means. And I think about the discussion that he has with Job and how Job, during his story, he's lost everything and he starts to question God. And God decides, okay, it's my turn to ask a question of you. In the 40th chapter, he tells Job, he says, do you have an arm like the arm of God? Are you strong like me? And so when I start thinking about those passages, I think about Jeremiah 27:5. It says, I have made the earth, the men and the beasts which are on the face of the earth, by my great power and my outstretched arm. And before we go any further, I want you to notice, in all of these things, it does not say arms. It only says arm. Because in this way, in this quiet, weird way that God speaks to us, what he's wanting us to know is he's saying, whatever's going on in your life, I can handle it with one hand behind my back. It's just my arm. All I need is one arm. And by my outstretched arm, I created everything. And he goes on, Jeremiah 32:17. Ah, Lord God, behold, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and your outstretched arm. Nothing is too difficult for you. Listen, we've got a big God, an amazing God, and he's a powerful God. He's bigger than our boogeyman. And when you think about it, several weeks ago I told you that when I was a little boy, I got into a discussion with another kid about my dad can beat up your dad. Y'all, if you're a guy, you've had this discussion. My dad can beat up your dad. Well, I actually read something the other day where a guy heard children on the playground, and one of them said to the other, my dad can beat up your dad. And the other boy said, big deal, so can my mom. Guys, our dad can beat up anybody's dad, just with his outstretched arm. We go further in Isaiah 59:1. He says, surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save. Not only does he have power to create, he has power to redeem. And the Lord answered, is the Lord's arm too short? Now you will see whether or not what I say will come true for you. If you follow boxing, Muhammad Ali passed away recently. And Muhammad Ali was a great fighter, but his real calling card was his reach. He had long arms. And he would reach out and tag a guy from a distance that the guy could not retaliate. We've got a God who, with his outstretched arm, created everything that you know. With his outstretched arm, redeems your life. With his outstretched arm, there is nothing that is impossible for him. For he's got a reach that we cannot imagine. And when we see that God, we have to have a big faith. So, if we have a big God and we start having this big faith, what does big life look like? God is big, duh, right? And when we start really understanding that, it draws us to him with this big faith. But what does it mean to have a big life? A lot of people think when Jesus said that I came that you may have life and have it to the full, it meant that all of our wishes and desires would come true, that he'd be this Santa Claus God. We ask for it, we get it. That's not who God is. God's a lot more interested in us being holy than he is for us being happy. Well, other people will say, well, an abundant life means that we're never going to have any trouble, never going to have any sorrow, nothing bad's ever going to happen. Well, that's not what life is, because sin is in the world, and we live in a fallen, broken, and impure world, so there will be bad things that are going to happen to us, so that can't be an abundant life. And so if we don't get all the stuff we want, we don't get all the situations we want, what does it mean to have an abundant life? It has to do with perception. Good example. Several years ago, I was on an airplane from Nashville to Chicago. And I get on the plane, and I'm riding in coach because I work for AT&T and they're cheap. And here I am sitting in coach, and I notice when I come in that there are two people, it's a 3-seat aisle, and there are two people already sitting there. There's one guy who was about my age that was sitting next to the window, and you could tell he was out of his mind. He was terrified. Had the window shade down. He was not looking out. He was not excited about this. I don't know how he got a window seat because I know he didn't ask for it. And Next to him was this older woman. I'll describe her in a minute. I'm about to get in, and the guy looks up at me, and he's terrified. He said, "Do you have the aisle seat?" "Yes, I do." "Can I sit there?" "Yes, you can." Because I like the window seat. And so he climbs over, I climb in, he sits there, and I mean, as soon as he sits down, I mean, the plane hasn't moved. He's buckling himself in. He is terrified. His hands are already gripping the arms of the chair. And then the woman next to me was Gomer Pyle's grandmother. I know it. Because she was asking questions about everything. She'd never flown before either. This other guy had never flown before. He was terrified. She'd never flown before. And she was looking around and saying, "What does that thing do?" She's pushing buttons, and the stewardess is coming back and turning the lights on and off and playing with the air. And she's looking, "Hey, look over there." And when that plane starts to take off, she says, "This is fun." I didn't know fun had 2 syllables, but real fun has 2 syllables. And we get in the air, and she's looking out the window, and I can't look out the window because she's leaning over looking out the window, and she is having a blast. Same pilot, same plane, same airline, same destination. One of them was terrified, and the other one was living large. We landed. Everything was okay. They both got off the plane. The intention of the flight came to pass. They got where they were going. But only one of those 2 lived an abundant life. Only one of those 2 had an abundant flight. And it was the woman who enjoyed the ride. See, we're not going to have everything we want. We're not going to get everything that we wish for. And we're not always going to have great situations. But we can enjoy the ride. The only way we really enjoy the ride is to know that we have a big God that leads us to big faith. You see, you need to know that God will never get bigger or stronger. However, our faith can be both. That God is who He is, and He's who He's always been, and He's not going to get bigger, and He's not going to get stronger, but our faith can be both. You know, my prayer this morning is that we see that. Whether it's from a distance or up close, we see who God is. And it reminds me of this last story. And we find it in the book of 2 Kings in chapter 6. It's the story of Elisha. He's been surrounded, and his servant is going out of his mind because he doesn't know how they're going to get out of this fix. And every time I read this story, I think of that scene in Gone with the Wind where the maid is running through the house. "Oh, Miss Scarlett, I don't know nothing about birthing no babies." You know, you remember that scene. And I can just see this guy saying, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" He's just pacing back and forward. And we read the story. It says, "Now when the attendant of the man of God had risen early and gone out, behold, an army with horses and chariots were circling the city. And his servant said to him, 'Alas, my master, what shall we do? I don't know nothing about birthing no soldiers.' And so he answered, 'Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them.' Then Elisha prayed, 'O Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see.'" Now, that's prayer for us. May God open our eyes so that we can see He's a big God. And the story goes on. And the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elijah. We have a big God who's got our blind side, and He is all around us. He is a God who is in control. Even when we feel surrounded and overwhelmed, God is still God. He can't get bigger, He can't get stronger, but our faith can. Big God equals big faith equals big life. I want to end with this story. You guys sometimes send me stories, inspirational stories, and believe it or not, I really do keep them. This is one I got a long time ago, and the person that sent it did not say where it came from. I'm assuming it came from like Chicken Soup for the Farmer's Soul or something like that, because it's a farmer story. And it was this farmer talking about how he used to sit behind a guy he was partnering in farming with as they took their tractor and their combine back from the field. And it said, "I'd hold on to the tractor seat with a good grip just in case one of the many ruts would throw me off balance. This is a very hazardous way to travel, but I'd grown accustomed to it. And what he was doing is he was standing behind the seat on a little 2-inch tow bar, balancing, holding on to the seat. And he said, this is a very hazardous way to travel, but I'd grown accustomed to it. On this trip, however, I'd reduced my grip in half because I was holding my son in one arm. Let's call DHS now. Along the way, the outright stupidity of what I was doing struck me. In a few seconds, a fear raged, and I began to look where I might attempt to roll if I should fall off, and how I'd best protect my son and I from being run over by the combine that was following the tractor. At the peak of my panic, I turned to my son to see what he was thinking. It was amazing. With the wind pushing back his hair and the sound of the tractor roaring in his ears, he was ecstatic. His face was aglow and his eyes danced with delight, and the bouncing only made him more jovial. Not only was he oblivious to the danger at hand, but he was thoroughly enjoying it. For him, there was no danger. As far as he was concerned, everything was fine. Often since that day, I've told myself that no matter how complex life's problems are or how imminent the danger, there's only one safe place. And that's safe in my Father's arms. We're all on a ride. Risk is all around us. We live in a broken and fallen world that seems to get more evil as the days go on. But I'm here to tell you, God's bigger than all that. And not only is He bigger than all that, but that enormity leads us to faith. It leads us to a confidence that we can live in, a confidence that we can walk in, that our God's got our blind side. He's our God. He is alive. And we owe it all to Him. God's big. Big God, big faith, big life.